Symbols are an important part of communication for students who can't use speech to meet their face-to-face communication needs. Historically, we thought there were certain prerequisite skills required before we could begin using symbols with students with significant disabilities. For example, we believed that there were certain receptive language or receptive vocabulary skills required. We also thought that there were prerequisites around cognitive ability that were required for a student to understand how symbols could be used to communicate. Over the past decade or so, we've begun to understand that in fact students with the most significant intellectual disabilities, including those with deafblindness and other multiple disabilities, are actually capable of learning to use symbols to meet their face-to-face communication needs. Another myth that we've held on to historically is the notion that there is a hierarchy of symbol use. This hierarchy suggested that first students would be able to use real objects or the real item in order to communicate, that we could then move on to miniatures followed by photographs and colored pictures and black and white line drawings, and eventually move to words. But the most recent research confirms that actually students can learn to use whatever symbol set it is that we teach them explicitly. In other words, we don't have to begin with concrete objects and then work our way up a hierarchy. We can begin introducing symbols, and by using those symbols explicitly in our instruction each day, students will learn to use those symbols. There are a number of things that we need to consider when we're trying to think about what symbols we're going to teach. For example, we need to have some understanding of what the student knows about communication intent. Are they students who are still using non-symbolic means to communicate in very unintentional ways? So do they cry, but they don't quite understand that by crying, they're communicating discomfort to someone else? Is the student able to point or use some simple gestures in some way? These aren't prerequisites, but we need to have some level of understanding of what students know about communication intent as we're introducing symbols to them. The same thing goes for their receptive vocabulary knowledge. While a certain level of receptive vocabulary knowledge should not be seen as a prerequisite, certainly the decisions we make about which symbols to use are influenced by the words that children understand in their receptive vocabulary. For example, we may choose symbols that represent concrete objects that we can help the child experience and interact with if we're not certain about that child's understanding of the label that goes with the things that we're trying to represent with a symbol. We also need to have some clear understandings of what the student's prior experience has been. Have they had opportunities to meaningfully use symbols? Have they had any opportunity at all? Or has their symbol interaction been limited to potentially some discrete trials of learning, just a couple, and not using them meaningfully throughout their day in order to make connections between these representations and the things that they're representing? We need to consider what's the reinforcement value of the symbol. Students are unlikely to have the first symbols they use be symbols that have no direct reinforcing value to them. Oftentimes people choose symbols like eat and drink and bathroom, and the truth is that most of the children that we work with have had several years of learning that someone's going to give them something to eat and drink and take them to the bathroom, and the reinforcing value of those kinds of symbols is pretty limited for the student that we're trying to teach. So instead we might choose a symbol that represents a favorite activity, or a symbol that represents a favorite object or toy or a person, and that's going to have a much higher reinforcement value than sort of the everyday, more functional things that we often turn to first. We also have to consider what's the support for the symbol use that's offered by the setting. If we only have one person in one setting who's going to do some work on the symbols, it's going to be very difficult for the individual to learn what that symbol represents and how to use it to communicate. We want to make sure that the setting offers multiple opportunities in varied ways to be learning and using the symbols that we're introducing. So it isn't just during one discrete instructional time or with one individual or in one setting, but that across the school day, we're very aware of the use of these symbols. All of the adults in the students' lives know what the symbols are that are being focused on and are intentionally finding opportunities to use and incorporate those symbols in their interactions with the students. Each one of these things make a difference in how quickly a student might be able to come to understand symbols, how they work, and what they're representing. The last thing that we want to keep in mind here is this notion of what's our purpose. Are we trying to introduce the symbol in order to get to functional communication as quickly as possible? Or are we introducing a symbol in order to build language? The distinction here is if we're trying to teach language, we can be a little more lenient in offering a wider array of symbols that we're going to use and model and interact with across the day. Not because our immediate goal is for the student to use the symbols functionally in their own communication, but that we're going to be modeling symbol-based approaches to communication, and we need more than just one or two symbols or three or four symbols in order to do that. If our purpose in introducing the symbols is to get the student using it functionally as quickly as possible, we're going to offer that student a more limited set. And so we have to be really aware of what that purpose is. And we hope that you'll have both of those purposes going on at the same time, that you'll have a smaller set of symbols that you're expecting the student to learn and use expressively in their own communication, but that you're modeling with a much bigger set in order to help the child understand how symbols can work to communicate and interact with the world. Typically, when we talk about communication symbols, people are talking about communication boards that look something like this. When you look at the examples that are provided in this particular communication board, you'll see that the emphasis in these particular choices are much more on commenting and on the individual who's learning being able to ask a question, asking for more, making requests. This type of interactive communication board gives us much more control over the number of opportunities we can provide for symbols. If our earliest symbols are really clear noun-based reference, it's really hard to come up with a wide range of opportunities to use those symbols across the day. But if the symbols that we choose are symbols that are more generic, that what we would call in the augmentative communication community are more core, they can be used across a wide variety of activities to communicate a diverse array of messages and to meet an array of communication functions. And so when we talk about these symbols, typically people are talking about these type of picture communication symbols. The ones that are on the screen right now are from Boardmaker, the company called Mayer Johnson. There are a number of other symbol sets that would provide this same range of symbols and supports for students that we teach. Many of the students with significant disabilities that we're teaching have severe visual impairments that make it impossible for them to process the kind of graphic symbol that I've shown you thus far. So one of the things to consider is the use of tactual symbols. There are a number of commercially available tactual symbol sets, but at the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies, we became aware of the fact that most of those sets were dominated by nouns, objects that could be represented in some tactual way. Yet, if we're going to offer children a wide range of opportunities to use the symbols that we're introducing, we'll get more bang for our buck if we use a different type of vocabulary. In this example, you see that we're offering this girl the opportunity to say things like that she likes something or not, or how something makes her feel, to request more, to say what she wants. This kind of range of communication symbols are often the last ones that people think about because they're not concrete, but their very nature allows them to be used in a broad array of activities, which increases the opportunities for us to model and therefore increases the opportunities for the child to learn. At the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies website, you'll find supports for how do you create a tactual symbol set like the one that we have here. But in general, what we've tried to do is create it in a way that's rule-based, not because we're going to teach the rules to the children who are learning the symbols, but the rules allow students to potentially take something we have taught them and apply it to something we haven't. So that in the way that students who have vision are learning graphic symbols and can begin to see patterns in the ways that graphics are drawn and things are represented, we wanted to provide a parallel structure for the tactual symbols. And so different parts of speech are in different shapes and textures and colors, and then there's an object on top of the symbol that represents the particular word that's being represented with that symbol. This is just a very brief overview, but an encouragement for you to think broadly about using symbols, that there aren't prerequisites, that there is not a hierarchy that we have to follow, that we can begin using graphic and tactual symbols in order to promote the kind of generalized learning of expressive communication that's required if we're going to get students beyond being able to communicate in the here and now. Thank you.